Into the Abyss, the Untold Agony of the USS Indianapolis. Prologue, The Box. July 16, 1945, San Francisco Bay. The wooden crate was unremarkable. It was roughly the size of a toolbox, secured with heavy-duty screws and banded with metal straps. It sat alone in the flag lieutenant's cabin on the heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis, guarded 24 hours a day by armed Marines who had orders to shoot to kill anyone who tried to touch it. Captain Charles McVay III, a dashing second-generation Navy man with a jawline straight out of Hollywood, didn't know exactly what was in the crate. He only knew two things. First, his orders came directly from the highest levels of the Manhattan Project and the White House. Second, if the Indianapolis sank, his primary mission was to put the crate in a lifeboat before saving any of his men. If the lifeboat sank, the crate was to be left to float. The crate contained the uranium-235 projectile for Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would soon fall on Hiroshima. As the Indy steamed under the Golden Gate Bridge, setting a speed record for the run to Pearl Harbor, the 1,195 men on board felt lucky. They were heading away from the bloody battles of Okinawa. They were on a milk run. They didn't know they were sailing toward the worst shark attack in human history. Chapter 1. The Lone Hunter. July 29, 1945. The Philippine Sea. The Pacific Ocean is a desert of water. It is vast, deep, and terrifyingly silent. Underneath the surface, Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto peered through the periscope of the Japanese submarine I-58. Hashimoto was a man of honor, but he was losing the war. The Imperial Navy was decimated. He was hungry for a kill. For days he had seen nothing. The moon was hidden behind clouds, making the night pitch black. Visibility was poor, but Hashimoto had something the Americans didn't expect. The Kaiten. These were human-guided suicide torpedoes, metal coffins driven by pilots destined to die for the Emperor. But tonight, he wouldn't need the suicide pilots. At 11 p.m., his hydrophone operator picked up a sound, a ship, a big one, traveling straight and fast. It was unescorted. On the surface, the USS Indianapolis was alone. Captain McVay had requested a destroyer escort for the dangerous leg between Guam and Leyte, but his request was denied. The waters are safe, he was told. He was not told that an American destroyer had been sunk by a Japanese sub in that very sector just days before. This vital intelligence was withheld from him due to bureaucratic incompetence and secrecy. Because of the cloud cover, McVay had ordered the ship to cease jigjagging, a defensive maneuver used to throw off enemy aim. Jigjagging was only required during good visibility or when a threat was confirmed. In the dark, he wanted to get to Leyte fast. Hashimoto plotted his solution. He didn't use the suicide torpedoes. He ordered 6 conventional Type 95 torpedoes loaded. "Fire," he whispered. Chapter 2. 12 Minutes to Hell. July 30th. 12:14 a.m. The first torpedo hit the starboard bow. It blew 40 feet of the ship's nose completely off. The massive cruiser shuddered as if it had hit a mountain. Men sleeping in the forward berths were incinerated instantly or crushed by twisting steel. Before the crew could even register the shock, the second torpedo hit. This was the death blow. It struck amidships, directly under the fuel tanks and powder magazines. The explosion ripped the Indianapolis in half. The ship's electricity failed instantly. Communications were cut. The PA system was dead. Chaos erupted in the darkness. Fire roared through the corridors, sucking the oxygen out of the air. Men, dazed and burned, scrambled up ladders that were already tilting at impossible angles. Captain McVay, thrown from his bunk, made his way to the bridge. The ship was listing heavily to the right. He tried to order a distress signal sent. SOS! SOS! The radio operators tapped it out frantically, but they never knew if anyone heard them. The ship was dying fast. Too fast. Abandon ship, the order was passed by word of mouth. Abandon ship. There was no time to launch the lifeboats properly. Men simply jumped. They jumped from the high railings into the oil-slicked black water below. Some broke their necks on impact. Others landed on top of their shipmates. At 12:27 a.m., just 12 minutes after the first torpedo hit, the stern of the USS Indianapolis rose vertically into the air. For a terrifying moment, it stood like a tombstone against the night sky. Then, with a groan of escaping air and twisting metal, it slid beneath the waves, taking 300 men down with it. Nearly 900 boys were left floating in the dark Pacific. They had no food, very little water, few life rafts, but they were alive. They cheered, believing the Navy would miss a massive capital ship and send rescue by morning. They were wrong. Chapter 3. The Sun and the Salt. Day 1, July 30th. Sunrise. When the sun rose, the horror of their situation became visible. The 900 survivors were scattered over miles of ocean. They were covered in thick black fuel oil, which burned their eyes and choked their throats. The oil, however, provided a strange mercy. It shielded their skin from the sun and masked their scent from predators, at least for a while. The groups were separated. Captain McVay was on a small raft with a few others, isolated from the main body of survivors. The largest group, hundreds of men, had no rafts. They floated in their life jackets, clinging to debris, cargo nets, or each other. They formed circles. The officers ordered the men to lock their arms, creating floating islands of humanity. "Stay together," they yelled. "The planes will see a big group." But as the sun climbed higher, the heat became a hammer. The reflection off the water blinded them. Thirst began to set in immediately. They had swallowed oil and salt water during the sinking, and now their bodies were screaming for fresh water. Then the screaming started. Chapter 4. The Feeding Frenzy. Day 2, July 31st. Dawn. The sharks arrived at dawn. They were oceanic whitetips, aggressive, opportunistic predators that roam the deep ocean. Jacques Cousteau once called them the most dangerous of all sharks. At first, the sharks were curious. They circled the perimeter of the floating groups, their dorsal fins slicing the oily water. The men watched in paralyzed terror. They kicked their legs and yelled, trying to scare the beasts away. Then the sharks began to test. A scream pierced the air as a sailor on the outer edge of the group was suddenly yanked under. The water churned white, then red. He resurfaced for a second, eyes wide with shock, screaming, "Shark! Shark!" before disappearing forever. Panic exploded. The men tried to climb on top of each other to get out of the water, pushing their friends down in a desperate bid to survive. The center of the circle was the safest. The edges were a slaughterhouse. For the next 3 days, this became the rhythm of their existence. The sharks would circle, the men would huddle. A shark would attack, a boy would die. The blood would attract more sharks. The sound of chewing, of bones snapping, traveled through the water. Even those who couldn't see the attacks could hear them. Chapter 5. The Madness. Day 3, August 1. The sharks were terrifying, but the sun and the salt were more lethal. By the third day, dehydration was killing more men than the predators. When the human body is severely dehydrated, the brain begins to shrink. Hallucinations set in. Some men began to drink the salt water. It was a suicide sentence. The salt spiked their blood sodium levels, causing their brains to swell. They went mad within minutes. "I see the ship," one sailor yelled, pointing at the empty horizon. "The Indy isn't sunk. She's just below the surface. The mess hall is open. They have ice-cold milk." He unbuckled his life jacket. "I'm going down to get a drink." He dove. He never came back. Others became violent. Paranoia swept through the groups. Men believed their friends were Japanese spies. Fights broke out. In their delirium, men held knives to each other's throats. They drowned each other. They beat each other to death in the water, while the sharks waited for the losers. Captain McVay, drifting miles away, watched the horizon with hollow eyes. He checked his watch constantly. Where were the search planes? Why hadn't anyone come? The truth was administrative negligence. Due to a flaw in the Navy's reporting system, the Indianapolis had not been reported overdue. No one knew they were missing. They were ghosts. Chapter 6. The Angel from the Sky. Day 4, August 2. Lieutenant Chuck Gwynn was flying a PV-1 Ventura bomber on a routine anti-submarine patrol. He was bored. His antenna wire had snapped, and he went back to the tail of the plane to reel it in. While looking down through the hatch, he saw an oil slick. He thought it was a Japanese sub. He scrambled to the cockpit to prepare a depth charge run. As he dove closer to the water to get a better look, he saw them. Hundreds of black dots bobbing in the oil. And then he saw the splashing. He saw the fins. "My God!" Gwynn radioed back to base. "There are men in the water! Hundreds of them!" Gwynn didn't know who they were, but he knew they were being eaten. He dropped life rafts and radios. He circled, dipping his wings to let the men know, "I see you. You are found." Down in the water, the men wept. Tears were the only moisture they had left. They watched the plane circle like a guardian angel. Soon, a PBY Catalina seaplane, piloted by Adrian Marks, arrived. Marks saw the sharks attacking the survivors. He saw men being dragged under while he watched. He made a decision that would end his career, but save his soul. He defied standing orders not to land in the open ocean. The swells were too high. Landing could tear his plane apart. Marks dropped the Catalina onto the waves. The plane bounced, groaned, but held together. He taxied toward the swimmers. "Get on!" his crew yelled. They pulled men out of the water. They stacked them inside the fuselage like cordwood. When the plane was full, they put men on the wings. They lashed them to the struts. The plane became a floating lifeboat, a sanctuary against the demons below. That night, the destroyer USS Cecil J. Doyle arrived. The captain turned his searchlights on, beaming a pillar of light into the sky, a beacon of hope, even though it risked attracting enemy subs. The nightmare was over. Chapter 7. The Scapegoat. The Aftermath. Of the 1,195 men who sailed on the Indianapolis, only 316 survived. The Navy was embarrassed. How could they lose a capital ship and not know for 4 days? How could they let hundreds of men die of thirst and shark attacks? The public would be furious. They needed someone to blame. They chose Captain Charles McVay. In a move that remains controversial to this day, the Navy court-martialed McVay. The charge? Failure to zigzag. It was a show trial. The Navy even brought in Mochitsura Hashimoto, the Japanese submarine commander, to testify against McVay.
It was the first time in history an enemy officer testified against an American captain during wartime. But Hashimoto surprised them. Through a translator, he said, "It would not have mattered. I had him in my sights. Zigzagging or not, I would have hit him." Despite this, the Navy convicted McVay. His career was ruined. He received hate mail from the families of the dead crewmen for decades. "You killed my son," the letters read. McVay lived with the guilt for years. In 1968, holding a toy sailor given to him by his father, Charles McVay walked into his garden and took his own life. He was the final casualty of the USS Indianapolis. Epilogue. Justice. It took 50 years and a 12-year-old boy to clear the captain's name. In 1996, a young student named Hunter Scott watched the movie Jaws, where the character Quint tells the story of the Indianapolis. Fascinated, Scott began interviewing survivors for a school history project. He realized the injustice. McVay was a scapegoat. Scott's project gained national attention. The survivors rallied. They went to Congress. In October 2000, President Bill Clinton and the U.S. Congress signed a resolution exonerating Captain McVay. The captain was innocent. The ocean had claimed the men, but the bureaucracy had claimed the captain. The story of the USS Indianapolis remains a testament to the brutality of war, the resilience of the human spirit, and the terrifying, silent power of the deep. Chapter 8. The Doctor's Vigil. August 1, August 2, 1945. While the sharks hunted on the perimeter, a different kind of horror was unfolding in the center of the groups. Lieutenant Commander Lewis Haynes, the ship's chief medical officer, was fighting a losing battle against death itself. Dr. Haynes was a man of science, floating in a realm of madness. He had no medical kit, no morphine, and no bandages. His hospital was a standard cork life ring. He would paddle from man to man, checking their eyes, feeling their pulses. "Doc, I'm thirsty," a young sailor whispered, his lips cracked and bleeding.
"Hold on, son," Haynes rasped. "Rescue is coming." But Haynes knew the truth. He watched as the boys began to die of exposure. When a man died in a life jacket, the body didn't sink. It bobbed there, face down, bumping into the living. Haynes realized that to save the morale of the survivors, he had to hide the dead. He became the ship's undertaker. He would swim to a corpse, recite the Lord's Prayer over the roar of the waves, and then cut the life jacket straps. He would watch the body sink into the abyss, then move to the next. By the third night, Haynes was holding a long line of kelp that the men had found floating. They pretended it was a telephone line. They passed it around, calling their mothers in Ohio, Texas, and New York. Haynes played along, nodding as delirious 19-year-olds had imaginary conversations with families who didn't even know they were missing. It was here, amidst the hallucinations, that Haynes saw the true strength of the crew. Men who were blind from the oil and sun would be held up by those who could still see. Those who had shoes gave them to those whose feet were being eaten by saltwater ulcers. They were dying, but they were dying together. Chapter 9. The Impossible Landing. August 2, 1945, late afternoon. Lieutenant Adrian Marks, piloting the PBY Catalina seaplane, looked down at the water. The scene was worse than Chuck Gwynn had reported. Marks could see the sharks attacking stragglers. He saw men waving feebly, their motions slow like insects trapped in amber. Marks checked his fuel. He checked the sea state. The waves were 12-foot swells, concrete walls of water to a landing plane. Navy regulations were clear. Do not land. Marks looked at his crew. "We're going down." He cut the throttle.
the massive seaplane dropped. It hit the top of a swell, bounced hard, shuddered violently, and slammed back down. Rivets popped, the hull groaned, but the plane stayed afloat. Marks taxied the plane toward the swimmers. The sound of the engines was the most beautiful thing the survivors had ever heard. "Grab the rings!" the crew shouted, throwing life preservers attached to ropes. The plane quickly filled up. Men were pulled into the waste blisters, vomiting oil and salt water onto the floor. When the fuselage was full, Marks ordered men to lie on top of the wings. They covered the wings, holding on to the struts, the wind whipping their sunburned skin. The plane was now so heavy it could never take off again. It was a sitting duck. As night fell, Marks sat in the cockpit, listening to the moans of the dying men stacked behind him. He kept the engines idling to generate power for the radio. He was their lighthouse. Chapter 10. The Pillar of Light. August 2nd, midnight. The USS Cecil J. Doyle, Jr., a destroyer escort, was the first ship to arrive on the scene. The captain, W. Graham Claytor, Jr., faced a terrifying choice. If he used his searchlights to find the survivors, he would light up his own ship like a Christmas tree in the middle of enemy waters. If a Japanese sub was still nearby, and I-58 was, the Doyle would be an easy target. Claytor didn't hesitate. "Turn on the lights," he ordered. "All of them." A massive 24-inch searchlight beam shot straight up into the clouds. Another beam swept the ocean surface. To the men in the water, it looked like the second coming of Christ. Captain McVay, drifting miles away on his raft, saw the beam of light reflecting off the clouds. Tears streamed down his face. He knew his men were being found. The rescue took days. Ships arrived and began pulling oil-slicked skeletons from the water. The sailors on the rescue ships were hardened veterans, but they wept openly as they hauled the survivors aboard. The skin of the survivors was so soft from immersion that it sloughed off when rescuers grabbed their arms. They were dying, but they were dying together. Chapter 11. The Cultural Echo. Jaws. 1975. For 30 years, the story of the Indianapolis was largely forgotten by the general American public, overshadowed by the atomic bomb and the end of the war. Then came Steven Spielberg's movie, Jaws. In a quiet scene in the galley of the boat Orca, the character Quint, played by Robert Shaw, tells the story to Brody and Hooper. It is considered one of the greatest monologues in cinema history. "Japanese submarine slammed 2 torpedoes into our side, Chief. We was coming back from the island of Tinian to Leyte, just delivered the bomb, the Hiroshima bomb. 1,100 men went into the water. Vessel went down in 12 minutes. Didn't see the first shark for about a half an hour. Tiger, 13-footer. Quint's speech brought the horror of the Indianapolis crashing back into the American consciousness. He described the lifeless eyes, black eyes, like a doll's eyes, of the sharks. While the movie got some facts wrong, it wasn't tiger sharks, but oceanic whitetips. The date was slightly off in the script. It captured the emotional truth of the terror. Suddenly, a new generation of Americans wanted to know, did that actually happen? The movie reignited interest in the tragedy, eventually leading to the movement that would clear Captain McVay's name. 2017. The North Pacific. For 75 years, the wreckage of the USS Indianapolis lay undiscovered. It was one of the holy grails of shipwreck hunting. In August 2017, a team led by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen aboard the research vessel Petrel located the ship. It rests at 18,000 feet, 5,500 meters, deeper than the Titanic. The underwater drones sent back high-definition images. There, in the eternal darkness, lies the ship. The number 35 is still visible on the hull. The anti-aircraft guns are pointing upward, still ready to fight. The bridge where McVay stood is silent. The discovery brought closure to the few remaining survivors. It was no longer a lost grave, it was a memorial. The USS Indianapolis remains a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice. It delivered the weapon that ended the war, but it paid the highest price. The men who went into the water faced the worst nature could throw at them, and they held the line. They are the guardians of the deep.